And we want to just jump right into it. And one of the major issues, I guess I keep, maybe I was foreshadowing this here in my introduction, Rania, is the ongoing saga, I guess you could call it, as it concerns the outcome of the elections in Venezuela. There have been a number of important happenings that have taken place over the past several weeks, and we want to get into all of that, what it means, and perhaps some of what we can look for in the future. And as always, we are very, very honored to be joined by Zoe Alexandra, who is a journalist and editor of People's Dispatch, who also was there on the ground during the Venezuelan elections, several weeks ago. Zoe, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's great to have you, as always. A lot of things are happening around the elections, and I guess we'll sort of get into it all. But I think the most important factor that I was hoping you could talk about is the Venezuelan Supreme Court, which was asked by President Nicolas Maduro and various other opposition figures to adjudicate the dispute over the outcome, has rendered their ruling about what took place. What have they said, Zoe, and what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, this was a much expected ruling from the Venezuelan Supreme Court. As we know, in the days and week following this democratic process, as the opposition began to kind of ramp up their campaign in saying that fraud had taken place and all of the other things that we've covered here at People's Dispatch, and I know you've covered also on Breakthrough News, Nicolas Maduro came out and said, okay, if you're alleging there's fraud, why don't we bring this to the competent institutions? It's not, the competent institution is not international corporate media who can say, okay, if the opposition says there's fraud, and that's how the decision gets made. Actually, he said, in order for this to have a peaceful and democratic resolution, we must turn to the institutions in our country to resolve this matter. And so he said that his party, PSUV, was going to bring, all of their electoral tallies that they collected on the day of the elections, and called on all the other parties to do the same. And so the Supreme Court kind of accepted this petition from Maduro and, had called on all the parties' representatives and the candidates to appear before the Supreme Court to present the famous tallies, which essentially every single party would collect on election day, in addition to the National Electoral Council. And so that happened again in the beginning of August, and they rendered their ruling last week to say that after reviewing all of the tallies of the different parties, that it confirms the results that were released by the CNE, which said that Maduro had won with 51% of the votes. And this is, really important because, again, if the opposition is alleging that with their tallies that fraud was committed and that Edmundo Gonzalez won with 70% of the vote, the Supreme Court basically just said, we actually reviewed the tallies of 8 parties and electoral alliances, and they say the exact same thing as the Electoral Council said, and that is that Maduro won the vote with 51%. So, it should be a case closed kind of situation. Different concerns were raised. The competent bodies did the checks that they needed to do, and there is sort of this resolution, which, most sectors of society said, okay, yeah, that sounds about right. On to the next thing. On to actually continuing to build the country and continuing with rebuilding the economy. But of course, we know that the U.S. has not really recognized this, and neither has the opposition.
Zoe, can you speak a bit about the neighboring countries? Because a lot has taken place and some surprises, especially given the way that Brazil's leader and Colombia's leader have behaved in response to the U.S. alleging this election fraud and recognizing this opposition leader that did not win. Mexico's also taken a certain stance. Can you talk a bit about how things have played out regionally with these particular countries, as well as what's happened throughout through the OAS?
Definitely. So I just wanted to start by saying that Laura Richardson, the general of the U.S. Southern Command, which is the Southern Command of the U.S. Army, one of the many different kind of sections that it has, is currently in Chile for this huge kind of like army conference with generals from the region, and she said yesterday, while in Chile, that Venezuela's election was a clear example of how democracy is being undermined across the world. And it's funny because obviously she's saying this from Chile, a U.S. Army official. The irony is kind of overflowing in that sense. But it's important to point out, to start here, because we've seen Gabriel Boric really, really come down hard. And this isn't that much of a surprise in a sense. He was considered to be a sort of progressive leader. He comes out of the student movement. But in terms of geopolitics, we've seen him have really strong alignment with Ukraine, for example. He's been kind of like the one Latin American leader who's really rallied behind U.S. and NATO war efforts, having a lot of meetings with Vladimir Zelensky, and constantly reiterating Ukraine's right to self-defense. And unsurprisingly, he has been sort of the fresh new face on the front line of attack against Venezuela. Even there was a leak conversation that came out that even before the elections took place, that there was sort of direction and orientation for people to ask about these electoral tallies, indicating that this was going to be the path that they would take in mainstream media to talk about the illegitimacy of the electoral process. So Chile has been one of the countries that's really turned its back on Venezuela and has been kind of rallying other countries to do the same. Argentina, again, we've talked about Milei a lot of times. There's really no surprise there. His whole libertarianism, fight against communism, fight against leftism, really part and parcel of his whole charade. But it's interesting because at the same time that Milei is rallying against Venezuela, his country has 75% rate of poverty, 65% of children in poverty in his country. So perhaps he should be more concerned with his own country than what's happening in Venezuela. And what you mentioned, Rania, there is, there was this sort of centrist bloc, in a sense, that was trying to say, okay, let's wait to see what the competent Venezuelan institutions say. We're not going to recognize neither the victory of Edmundo Gonzalez nor the victory of Maduro. We're going to wait and see. This sort of bloc was led by Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, Lula, Petro, AMLO. And we did see a sort of kind of deviation or perhaps a new path charted by Petro and Lula, who were saying that, it seems a little difficult. It seems like maybe there's no possibility for Venezuelans to actually resolve Venezuelans' problems, and that there should be new elections. Maybe there should be a government of cohabitation, which would essentially mean PSUV ruling with the far-right opposition, which is completely unheard of. These positions were presented in sort of informal settings, in radio interviews, on social media. Many people were shocked by this, but again, it's sort of their attempt to mediate and come on the world stage as the people who are like solving problems. But again, completely undermining Venezuela's institutions. But in that vein, Mexico has actually maintained its position. And I think that with the Supreme Court ruling, notably there's been a little bit less in the news of these leaders trying to kind of instigate. And I think we're going to see in the coming weeks that as things have already calmed down in Venezuela, as we're not seeing any sort of attempts to sort of create violent protests, all of that has really died down. The opposition, in a sense, has really been defeated on the streets. I think we're also going to see, hopefully, an international kind of corporate media that they also realize that this is a lost cause and that, at the end of the day, the Venezuelan people spoke and they voted for Maduro. It was a, very close election. 51% is not a landslide, but it is a victory. And so we'll see where that goes in the coming days.
into here and a lot to be said, and not to leave it unsaid that Gabriel Boric had no problem recognizing the coup government in Peru right away. But that's, I guess, a whole other question. But I do want to ask you, Zoe, because one of the issues that I think has become most discussed here is around maybe the essence of what democracy really means. And we recently saw this or in the past several days, the National Popular Consultation, another form of electoral process there rooted in the commune movement of Venezuela. And I think this is, its own part of the discourse as it concerns what democracy really means and how it's being framed vis-a-vis the elections.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, since the Bolivarian Revolution began with Chavez winning the presidential elections in 1998, I think there's been over 30 electoral processes, and this includes referendums, popular consultations, presidential elections, legislative elections, all sorts of things. So, on one hand, when we're thinking about democracy and what is going to the polls, the Venezuelan people have been actively going to the polls, participating in this one form of democracy, which is, casting your vote. So Venezuela really excels at actually putting in the resources to have this form of directly hearing people's opinions, people's desires on how the country should move forward. But Venezuelan and Bolivarian democracy is far from limited to electoral processes. And so what you were referencing there, Eugene, of the National Popular Consultation is a process that began, the first one took place in April of this year. And, it's people, it's working class people who are organized in different communal circuits and different communal councils, going, carrying out a very lengthy process before heading to the polls, which involves consulting in the community, having different series of meetings and assemblies, and identifying what are the key needs, material needs of the community, where would they like government resources to go. So if you're from most countries in the world, you know that, for example, you might have potholes in your neighborhood, you might have, problems with sewers, many different infrastructural problems, and oftentimes there's really no avenue for you to actually demand that the government deal with those, invest resources into bettering them. Maybe it's a common belief amongst the community that there's a real need for a children's after-school center or different sorts of things that would benefit the community. And what this popular communal consultation is actually giving people the ability to not only come up with those proposals amongst their community, but then actually to vote on which project do they want to be funded by the state and actually getting that funding and taking that forward. So, I think the Bolivarian project and the Bolivarian democracy really expands and redefines what democracy means in the 21st century. I think in most countries in the world, we're seeing the erosion of democracy. We're seeing the erosion of this grand idea of liberal bourgeois democracy. In the US, third-party candidates aren't even able to get on the ballot without a huge legal fight. Whereas in Venezuela, there's dozens of parties and people are participating in creating a new form of democracy, but also really bringing their voice and their concerns to people in power and actually being able to kind of distribute not only resources, but power back into communities.
Mm-hmm. No, well, extremely interesting process. And thankfully, we have outlets like People's Dispatch who have been covering all of the details of everything happening with the presidential election and national popular consultation and just about everything else in Venezuela and seemingly every country on earth. So make sure that is in your browser. Zoe Alexandra, you are the editor of People's Dispatch. And as always, we really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.